What's the biggest culture shock you ever experienced? My parents were the typical Asian kind. Hard to please and difficult to impress. When I graduated class valedictorian for 6th grade, my mother complained that I did not receive any other award like best in science or best in math. When I fell down the ranks of top students, I was still in the top 10 though. My father told me that the reason he stopped attending school events was because he was ashamed of me. When my elder sister got pregnant a couple of months before graduating med school, my mom stopped talking to her for a month. They lived across the hall from each other, unforgiving of failures. That was the kind of parents that we had. When my girlfriend took her licensure exam for accountancy for the first time, she failed the test. I was with her when she told her parents about it. To this day I still remember the shock I felt for what transpired that day. We were seated in her dorm beside my girlfriend and opposite us were her parents. She was finding it difficult to confess, and when the words "I failed" finally came out, the first thing her father said were "that's okay." Then my girlfriend started crying and her parents consoled her. They were hugging and giving her words of encouragement, assuring her everything will be alright and that the thing to do is to move forward and try again. I just sat there watching them and feeling envious, thinking this is what parents should be doing for their children. It came as a total shock to me. This level of openness and understanding this kind of parent-child relationship was alien to me. I promised myself that if I were to become a father I would be like her parents. I don't hate my parents though. They weren't bad people. They just had ridiculously high expectations of their kids. My siblings and I had a happy childhood for the most part. Sometimes we would sit and talk about how crazy our parents are and laugh a lot. When I was a kid, one of my mother's friends was a woman from a very tough background who had left her husband because he used to hit her and her children. She had 3 kids and was living in a 2-bedroom council flat in a tough part of Glasgow. My mum met her because they were both doing part-time university degrees as mature students. She was studying to get a teaching qualification. I became friends with one of this woman's kids when I was about 6 or 7. I'd go over to his house for the night sometimes and we'd generally wander around the local neighborhood just doing what kids do. He always carried a rucksack and was always on the lookout for empty glass soda alcohol bottles. If he saw one, he'd grab it and stick it in the rucksack. After a while I started bringing a rucksack along when I visited so we could double up on glass bottle carrying capacity. The reason he did this was that, in Glasgow back then, a sort of proto-recycling scheme meant that every one of those bottles was redeemable for 5p at any shop that sold them. They'd collect them, give out 5p per bottle, send them off to be recycled, and be reimbursed for their time by the local government. We'd collect a bunch of these then. When we went back to the flat in the afternoon, my friend would proudly hand over a few quid in coins to his mother. He used to do this constantly and it meant, this being the 1980s, a decent little earner to help pay for a bit of the household expenses and so on. I came from a family with a detached house in the suburbs that had 2 cars, 2 parents, 2 nice holidays a year, and no real worries when it came to money. Not rich, just lucky to be standard middle class. Meanwhile, this woman was raising 3 children by herself while studying to become a teacher, in a tiny little damp flat in a bad part of town. She never asked her son to do what he did. He just took it upon himself aged 7 or whatever to go out and do it. It took me a while to understand what was happening, but once I did, I can honestly say it was one of the defining events of my life. Bit of an aside, but thank you for the nostalgia. I have fond memories, as a kid growing up in Glasgow, of going round collecting bottles for pocket money. A lot of road workers drank pop from glass bottles and we must have collected 20 quid's worth when they did up a load of the streets around us. Recently moved to the US 9 months ago, and I am still not used to everyone asking me how I am doing. I am from Norway, and if the cashier asks how you are, you get embarrassed and don't know how to answer. Trying to cross the street in Hanoi, Vietnam. You can spot somebody who just gotten a mile away because of the look of apprehension and confusion on their face as they try to figure out how to do it. There are very few crosswalks with walk signs. In most places you look for a gap in the traffic and go. In Bangkok you just make sure the flow of traffic would have time to stop before they hit you and you just go and maintain a constant pace. In Hanoi, especially near the French Quarter, you just slowly walk into traffic. There are no gaps. You can sort of put your hand out to let people know you're going. but you just kind of maintain a slow, inching, walking pace and traffic will part around you. Scary AF the first time. I am Michael Gusoff from Argentina and Spain. I eat lunch at 12.30 hours and they are shocked. And the fact that for them lunch is at 16.00 is too crazy for me. Argentina is on a different schedule. I lived in Buenos Aires for couple months. You can hardly find anything open before 10.00. It's a city that wakes up late and stays up late for sure. I freaking love that city though. Moved to Australia from the Philippines. Driving normally between 60-80 kph is just impossible to achieve in Manila. Traffic management has been superb. Melbourne, as compared to Manila, so I just laugh inside my head when people here complain about being stuck behind the right light for like 2 minutes or something. I've driven all over the world, but the one place I refuse to take the wheel is the Philippines. People complain about traffic in Toronto, and I just shake my head and say Manila. Holidaying in Tokyo and watching 5-year-old kids walk themselves home from school and catching public transport, all by themselves. I taught in Japan. My first week there, a kid fell asleep on the train and some random old lady buttoned up his jacket and tucked his bag under his arm. Came to NYC and located a good British chippy in Lower Manhattan. Bought sausage chips and gravy. Would be about 3-4 quid back home. The British guy behind the till managed to keep a straight face as he charged me $20. I was born and raised in Peru but left for the US in my early 20s. Despite things being far from rosy at the beginning, I was mostly pleasantly shocked. Drivers would stop for me if I was coming close to a street corner. Kids 18 years old were getting their own places with a friend or girlfriend. Weed smoking was so commonplace. I could make in an hour of fast food work what I would in a day back at the old birthplace. People were generally nice and polite, and they smile more often to strangers. Also, 2-inch bulletproof glass at the counter at a KFC in Pennsylvania, and they gave you your food via a revolving tray window. Moved down to Florida and oh man, all that open space and beautiful houses. Everyone has a car. My family could never afford one growing up, so I didn't even know how to drive. Supermarkets were fancy and no one asks you to show your receipt when you are leaving, just in case you are stealing something. Got a job at golf resort. Busser at a nice brunch place. So much food. My typical breakfast was 2 pieces of bread with margarine spread and instant coffee. Scrambled eggs were like for Sundays. These rich fricks be having mimosas and eggs benedict. Pancakes the size of dinner plates with chocolate chips. Is this Narnia? Bathrooms and fancy hotels. I would often start redesigning the place in my mind to turn it into my room. Back at the beginning I was just fascinated with Walmart. Everything in the known universe is available, and often stuff and brands I considered rather in the luxury category would be cheaper than they were in Lima. After 12 years I was recently forced to move back to Peru. I am convinced drivers are actually trying to kill me. Everything is fenced and I can't get a job that would cover my room's rent plus food and transportation. No one cleans after their dogs. That one really bugs me. The biggest shock of all is how much of an alien I feel like. Even worse than when I first moved to the US. Sure makes me appreciate my time there a lot more. So I'm Norwegian, but I went to New Zealand for a year. The culture shock for me was how open Kiwis talk, and how there's no such thing as stranger danger. And as a typical Norwegian introvert, it took a while to get used to. I'd meet a stranger and they'd be breaking the touching barrier right away and start talking about their cousin's rash and all their weekend plans. Even bigger shock returning to silent Norway. I was born in Hawaii and lived on the Big Island until I was 6. Little me was used to wearing flip-flops, or no shoes, and lightweight dresses, swimsuits and shorts and a t-shirt everywhere. It was too hot for anything else, or it would just get dirty. Cut to my family moving to Ontario, Canada, about 3 hours north of Toronto. My dad was working in the vacation business, so we moved to an actual ski resort for the first few months. My sister and I were enrolled in Catholic school and suddenly I had to wear clothes. But not just clothes. Stockings, jumpers, shirts with too many buttons and shoes that had to shine. Coats, hats, gloves, different shoes to wear outside. 6-year-old me could not comprehend any of this. We even had to change for gym and then change back. My mom helped me put my stockings on in the mornings, but after gym I would have to put them on by myself. One day my teacher called my mom to come get me because I decided to start some sort of anti-clothing revolution and was jumping around the changing room in my underwear with my stockings on my head. TLDR. Moved from the big island of Hawaii to Canada at 6 and suddenly had to wear a lot of complicated clothing. This reminds me of the plot of the Disney Channel movie Johnny Tsunami. Marrying into my wife's Mexican-American Native American family. I come from a small white family. My wife's family is huge. At our wedding I had 15 people attend, which was nearly my entire family. She had 200 people attend, which is only a small fraction of her family. Those that didn't get invited were quite grumpy about not getting invited. When I first met her extended family I was overwhelmed. There was like 50-60 people at her grandma's house on Christmas. Some of her uncles didn't like how quiet I was being and started telling my wife, girlfriend at the time, how she needed to be careful of the quiet ones, and several of them took me aside to threaten me. Then of course I made a major faux pas. I refused food from her grandma. I've since learned that it would have been better to just slap her in the face. It took me 10 years to undo that damage. I didn't win over her last uncle until I got absolutely tanked at his daughter's wedding reception. At which point he decided I wasn't just a stuffy white guy. Once my wife coached me on her culture I was able to fit in better, asking for food, allowing the women to serve me and clean up after me, taking plates home when I leave, being more outgoing, etc. Now grandma calls me Mijo and introduces me to everyone as her grandson, which earns her a lot of confused looks. Since her grandma has accepted me everyone else has too, and according to my in-laws I'm Mexican now. All in all would do again, but it would have been nice to know that what's rude on the white side of my family is endearing on my Mexican side and vice versa. I refused food from her grandma. Faints in Cuban. Probably when I was in China and people would either come up to me and ask to take a picture of me, or just straight up starting taking pictures of me right in front of me. I'm 6'2" and a woman and they thought I must be a model, or a freak. I mean people think it's odd where I live but they don't come up to me and go you're tall. Picture? One guy stopped taking pictures of animals in the zoo to take pictures of me. I must be on so many Chinese people's social media and family photos. People would come up with their kids and think it was great. Basically this, but I'm 6'6" and had longish hair and a beard at the time. It was okay in Shanghai where the locals are totally over funny looking layaway, but when I went to Hangzhou it was freaking ridiculous. I got to experience all the absolute worst aspects of being a celebrity with none of the perks. Last year my wife and I took a trip to Japan for 2 weeks. The trip itself went splendidly, and we particularly appreciated how polite things were at all times no matter where we went. Then we flew into O'Hare Airport in Chicago. I grew up in a working class city where passive aggression wasn't a thing. If people didn't like you they made it obvious. Shouting matches and fist fights were pretty common. Then I get a job at a snooty Ivy League university and nobody expresses what they actually think or feel. Snide remarks replaced insults. People quietly conspire against you while pretending to be your friend. And you can't call people out on their bulls without getting socially shunned because everybody is neck deep swimming in it. I went the opposite way, from college to a union job. It was refreshing when some jackass was late and you heard, "Hey mother, show the freak up on time tomorrow and stop being a piece of crap." I set up a nice candle-lit dinner at home for GF once. In the middle of dinner she drops that candles remind her of extremely poor family who had to ration their candles into minutes and they had to multitask to conserve light. You had to do your homework all at the same time cause the candles only lasted so long. Still tears me up. A few years back, our family went to Japan for a family trip. We were in a restaurant, and my dad tipped our waitress while we were leaving. About 5 minutes after we left, we saw our waitress running down the street. She handed our money back to us. We were all confused, so my dad tried to hand the tip back to her. She wouldn't take the money, and ran back to the restaurant. We didn't realize this, but tipping is considered rude in Japan. It's not rude really, they would accept it if they could. They're really just very careful about any and all rules. If you become friendly with a waiter etc over several visits, especially if it's not a chain establishment, and do it inconspicuously. There's a chance they'll accept the tip. When I got my first teaching job, I had moved from Nye, Pennsylvania to southern Arizona. I rented a house with my husband and another couple. The house was huge, absolute insanity for what we paid for it. When my students found out I lived in a 2-story house, they all were in disbelief. I was told that only rich people lived in 2-story houses because no one can afford the AC bill in the summer. In my defense, I was making around $29,000 a year and paying for a cross-country move. So definitely not rich, but it really put my students' level of poverty smack dab in front of my face. Rock concerts in Japan. You have a number on your ticket and everyone queues according to that number. Yes, they managed to queue of hundreds of people in front of a venue according to the order in which they bought their ticket. It's fair. If you buy your ticket early, you can get the chance for a better spot and you have a chance to buy limited merch that is usually sold out after minutes. When the venue opens, they call out every number and as soon as yours is called out you can go in. They do that every time. They do that at small venues with 20 people waiting and they do that at festivals. Another thing, even after 2 days of festival, the venue is clean as frick. Not one water bottle, not one wrapping paper or anything. I was at Summer Sonic, Fuji Rock and Osaka Met Rock, and it was clean everywhere. Japan is all about the RESPECT. In India, we have a system of printing prices for each and everything on the box packet of that thing. This includes everything from a tiny pack of gums to a giant refrigerator. Vendors cannot charge more than the MRP. They can charge less than that. Most of the big supermarkets and malls usually charge less than the MRP. However, in Europe, I've never seen this. Anyone can charge any price for anything. I've seen a pack of milk can be sold at 4 different prices in my nearby stores. In India, if the owner charges more than the MRP, a consumer can lodge a complaint against them, and they can face serious consequences. Watching children in Mexico happily eating crickets like they were popcorn. Also, 4 or 5-year-old kids out at 10 PM to sell gum. They also sell cigarettes. There are a few, so I will list them in chronological order. The buildings full of bullet holes and the warning signs for mines in Bosnia. Such a contrast with the beautiful nature and mountains they have there. The hectic life in Gemma LFNA. The central square of Marrakesh, Morocco. Oh, and fully veiled women. You could see only the eyes. Asking if you wanted a tattoo. Buses in Santo Domingo that had no doors and the feeling of being careful at all times in Dominican Republic. Also the heavy contrast between the rich and the poor. Within 10 kilometers I saw restaurants with Rolls Royces, lobsters, private jets, barrios, slums, made of corrugated iron and children without any clothes around. Poverty and the trash in Haiti. The contrast between the doctor and Haiti is extreme. In the doctor we saw Haitian men working demolition with no shoes and a homemade sledgehammer. When I was a little kid in New York, my elementary school took an overnight field trip to Washington, D.C. As we were waiting in traffic to enter the White House, there was a burn barrel across the street with several homeless people huddled around it. Right across the street. I was about 9 and this was the late 1980s. I lived on Long Island. I had seen homeless on trips into the city, but it was the juxtaposition of the poverty contrasted by the White House that was such a culture shock to me. When a large Maori man asked to touch noses with me in greeting, the dude looked pee until I manned up and was the first to touch noses. Then he had one of the best smiles I've ever seen on a mountain of a man. It lit up the entire cultural center. This happened to me in the bathroom of a pub my second night in Auckland. Dude looked like straight out of Once Were Warriors. Dude pulled me in real strong, held my head to his and then sighed, "Welcome to Aotearoa. I loved living in NZ. Best 3 years of my life." Weirdly enough, it was returning to America after spending years abroad in Albania. As mentioned elsewhere in this thread, Albania didn't have any international food chains or restaurants. Everything was local and, usually, tasted great. I think what it was for me was when I was going to Albania, I psyched myself up. I knew I was going to a foreign country and that things would be different. And they were. Most stores were no bigger than the size of my bedroom back home. Open-air street markets were common and roadside shops were everywhere. Most people didn't own vehicles and walked or relied on public transportation. But when I returned to America, I was just going home and didn't really think about it much. But after several years it was weird. The day after returning home, we went to a Costco. Walking around that place on that day was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Packages of food were huge and there was just so much of everything. We drove our cars everywhere and I realized my little hometown doesn't even have a proper bus system. That was easily my biggest culture shock, and it was about my own. Reverse culture shock is a thing. Was homeschooled all my life and then went to high school so that I could get a diploma to join the military. I mean, dang. What a culture shock. Riding a civilian plane from the UAE to Baghdad. Smoking. Standing during landing. No rules during flight, etc. The lack of airline etiquette and rules was pretty eye-opening. That sounds awful. I hate flying as it is already. That flight would probably be the end of me. Small town Oklahoma as a black man by myself. I was in a bar and was actually told, you just changed my opinion about black people. It was by an older white guy who hadn't seen a black person in person since Vietnam. Work for the police in an Oklahoma adjacent state. One of our newer officers took a report from a guy in our lobby. At the end of the conversation, the old man in overalls congratulated our officer on his job because he didn't think our agency hired black folk. I grew up in a relatively poor neighborhood. Lot of rough crap going on there, but we won't discuss all of it. Suffice it to say, even at a fairly young age I was pretty sure I'd seen some crap. In middle school I made friends with a kid that lived in the trailer park across town. The trailer park kids are a whole different type of poor. I remember the kid I was friends with as soon as I got there goes, "Let's go to the creek." Darius got his fishing pole back. Okay, whatever the heck that means. So we go down to the creek and there's this kid Darius and he's fishing in a creek and there's about 12 kids standing around watching him. Every so often he's catching a fish and handing it to one of the kids and the kid is taking the fish and running off giddy as heck. He finally catches one and hands it to my friend. He and I skip off back to his trailer. My friend takes the fish, as is, puts it in the microwave, and then when the microwave beeps he takes it out and starts eating it with a fork. I almost puked. Not sure if it counts as a shock as much as a slow realization because I've been going there all my life. But once I got to about 15 and visited Italy I started getting asked out by guys who just wouldn't take no for an answer. You reject a guy in the UK and they'll normally take it well, unless they're a bit unhinged. But in Italy I said no to strangers. Friends I'd known for years. People I'd met that night, all people who were otherwise normal. Who'd be so persistent that I had to either leave or use my cousin as a fake BF. My friend showed me a photo of herself and her mother on holiday in Italy. The two of them are smiling for the camera, oblivious to the crowd of leering men surrounding them. She said she just got used to it. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.